Hi, welcome to Curator's Corner, Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. Spy Museum historian and curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond, will be talking with Anne Sebba about her new book on Ethel Rosenberg. And Anne is a prize-winning biographer and former Reuters foreign correspondent. She's well known for the best-selling books That Woman, The Fabulous Les Parisiennes, which has two different subtitles. How the Women of Paris Lived, Loved, and Died in the 1940s is a sophisticated British title. For us in the US, it's How They Lived, Loved, and Died under the Nazi occupation. But we are here today to talk about this marvelous new book on Ethel Rosenberg. Anne is a former chair of Britain's Society of Authors, and she's now on the council. She is also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research. So Anne and Andrew are going to have a conversation about the book. And during the audience Q&A, that is when Ethel and Julius's son, Michael Mirapol, is going to be joining us, and he's a great friend of the museum, so we appreciate that. Anne is going to do a brief reading from the book, but before we get to that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Andrew, to give us a little context about the Rosenbergs at the Spy Museum.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm really excited to speak to you, Anne, so I'm really looking forward to it. So here at the International Spy Museum, one of the things that we try to do is connect individual lives, individual human beings, up to a larger historical canvas, which is something that quite fittingly Anne does in her book. So I'm looking forward to discussing that. And one of the things that we try to do is take you back in time to the context of the 1950s, the 1940s. And we use some of our artifacts to try to locate you in that place and time. So for example, with regards to the Rosenberg trial, we have a sketch of the implosion device that David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, is said to have provided to Ethel's husband, Julius. We've got a reproduction of a Jello box that was important in the case. And then last but definitely not least, we have a sketch from Pablo Picasso, and you see it here up on the screen. So Pablo said that the conviction of them would be a crime against humanity. So we have this, we try to capture this sense of the way that this trial divided opinion around the world, but also in the United States. So we have people that were protesting against, people that were protesting for, people like the Pope and Pablo Picasso that were speaking out against it. But what I've read is that at the time, around 70% of the American public were in favor of the conviction, and the majority of newspapers in the United States. But it's continued to remain a political litmus test, and Anne's book is quite timely, and I look forward to discussing it with her.
Thank you, Andrew. Is that over to me now? I'm just going to start by reading a short passage from my book, not something that I've written. I'm going to quote from a journalist who was writing at the time during the trial. So this is very important because the jury was not sequestered during the trial. So the fact that this evidence, this could be used as evidence, this was poisoning the minds of people, I think is very important. So here we go. Finally, on the afternoon of Monday, March the 26th, it was Ethel's turn to take the stand. She seemed to have paid more trouble than usual to her appearance. For today, she was wearing some carefully applied lipstick to go with her plain pink blouse and black skirt. although she appeared calm as she sat in the high-backed chair in a booth to the left of the judge. She must have been nervous as she took the oath and prepared to answer questions. She'd spent the past 2 weeks sitting silently in court, looking away as she endured her brother's accusations. This was her chance. Inez Robb, a former war correspondent turned syndicated columnist, wrote an astute account of Ethel's appearance, which also gave her millions of readers the frisson of uncovering the real woman beneath her bland exterior. Ethel resembled any woman you might meet in the supermarket. Robb wrote, "There are 50,000 Ethel Rosenbergs on the subway any workday morning. This 34-year-old woman sits at the defendant's table in court wearing the tired uniform of the clerk or stenographer, a dark wool skirt, a whitewash blouse, and a white wool sweater. Hers is a dish-face complexion, pasty, and features undistinguished. It's difficult to imagine this ordinary-looking woman, slightly dumpy, mixed up in anything as dashing as espionage, for she looks about as dashing as bread pudding. She does not even make the best of her naturally curly, dark hair. Her bob is neither long nor short, and it needs shaping. All in all, she looks innocuous and vacuous, until you come to her eyes. They are not only her best feature, but probably the clue to her being. They are large, dark, and extremely intelligent. There is no way to camouflage them or the mentality that lies behind them." So there you are. She was damned for what she looked like. She was damned for being too clever. She was positioned as an evil woman. On the one hand, you'd think she was ordinary, but by God, she wasn't ordinary at all. She was a wicked witch. So somehow Ethel came to symbolize an attack on American womanhood. And that really was what I wanted to try and examine in this book. I wanted to see why people were made to feel that Ethel was somebody that they had to be so frightened of that she had to be killed. And you know, people who write about her even now, one has the feeling that Ethel has to be killed again and again. It almost wasn't enough to kill her once. And it's this attack on a woman who, on the one hand, was ordinary, but on the other hand, was wicked and evil. I have tried really hard to undo on the basis of fact in my book. I really wanted to humanize her at best and reveal her as the woman I think she was, and that she has never had a chance really to be shown as this fully rounded mother. So I just wanted to start with that because I think it expresses so acutely why Ethel was this woman that people were meant to be so scared of that she had to be killed.
So just picking up on that point, Anne, so you've sketched out the Ethel Rosenberg that some people saw back in the 50s, or the Ethel Rosenberg that people have seen since then. Tell us about the Ethel Rosenberg that you have found during your research. Who put her on her feet, give her agency? Tell us who this woman actually was.
Well, in some ways, she defies labeling. I think many people have seen her as a victim, as a martyr, as the master to Julius, her husband, who was the slave. And really, she may be none of those things. She was a woman born in 1915 and into extreme poverty, the children of Jewish immigrants, although she was born in America, so she had access to the American dream. She was a clever girl. And really, her life changed when she went to school, Seward Park High School. She skipped a year because she was bright. And when she graduated in 1931, she could have gone to college. College was just opening up for women, but she had parents who didn't really value education. Her father was weak. Her mother actively did not see any point in women being educated, girls rather. And so Ethel had to do a stenographer's course, but really her great love was theatre, was acting and singing. She had a very fine voice, untrained. So even though Ethel left school and she worked in a company where she got involved in a strike, and that was very important to her, age 19, because she was developing a social conscience very early on. And when she was dismissed from her job and lost her wages for 6 months, and ultimately the National Labour Relations Board reinstated her with back pay. So that made her realize, as you say, that she could have agency, she could actually achieve something. That was very important. The other thing that you see with Ethel before she was 20 was her desire to perform, to sing. She put herself through a course of singing and acting at the Clark Settlement House. She won a scholarship, so she continued acting. But when she applied to join a choir, and this is interesting, not just any old choir, she applied to the very best, the Schola Cantorum, who performed at Carnegie Hall, and they rejected her the first time because she couldn't sight sing. So she found a piano. You know, this is the depression that she's growing up in, when people were throwing out furniture, and she managed to bring the piano back to her room, and she taught herself sight singing and went back for a second audition. And she got through the second time, having taught herself sight singing. So I think these two episodes really show a very determined, very single-minded young woman who was clever, but unsupported by her mother, who believed that education was only important for the sons in the family. Ethel had 3 brothers. The youngest one, 7 years younger than her, was David, and all the family love and effort and support was poured into David. So Ethel learned to be single-minded and do what she felt to be right without family support.
And just briefly, before we do a deep dive further into your book and into Ethel, I just wondered if you could just briefly connect this book, this project, to some of your other work. So when I was reading your book, I was thinking about another woman who was born just across the East River, Lady Randolph Churchill. And I know that you've sort of Lady Randolph Churchill, Wallace Simpson, Mother Teresa. There's a number of people that you've zeroed in on. I just wondered if you could just link this project into the rest of your work. Do you see it as a continuation, or is it pivoting in a fresh direction, or is it something else?
Well, there are lots of ways I could link them, actually. I like looking at misunderstood women, wives, mothers, sisters, when all the praise, or in this case, all the opprobrium, goes to the husband. Actually, one of my motivations was to extrapolate Ethel, to look at Ethel as an individual person and not a woman wrapped up as the Rosenbergs, those spies. So in the case of Jenny Churchill, Jenny Jerome as she was, why was it that when Winston became famous, everybody blamed Jenny for being a terrible mother? Why didn't they blame Randolph, who was an abusive father, was an appalling father? And I think Jenny was really important for Winston's growth. In the case of Wallace Simpson as well, who grew up in Baltimore. I mean, she's no saint, Wallace Simpson, and she's really hard to like, but I just believe it's so important to understand her. And as you very rightly said in your introduction, I'm a historian. The important thing is to set these women in context. What possibility, what power did they have at the time? And often it was simply to work through a son or a husband. But actually, they were often the sharper brains of that pairing. Not always, and I really don't want to generalize, but I do think that it is important to start looking insofar as we can, at women in their own right. But before we do this deep dive that you're talking about, there is actually another thing that links them, and that's the year 1936. I mean, I do write about women, and people believe that that's what I'm all about. And I don't argue with that, because historically it is women who haven't been written about. But 1936 was such a key year. And it was the year when Hitler marched into the Rhineland, breaking his treaty obligations, and when possibly Europe had the last chance to stand up to him. There was the Spanish Civil War, when many friends of Julius and Ethel were going off to fight in the Spanish Civil War and supporting the communists. It was a year when Ethel probably joined the Communist Party, but when many people saw communism as the only way to stand up to fascism and Nazism. And so, whereas Ethel's communism was two-pronged, I mean, it definitely had a social focus, doing better for the poor people on the Lower East Side that she grew up with, but it also had this international dimension. How were you going to stop this great evil of Hitler and Mussolini and Franco in Spain? France had a Popular Front government led by Léon Blum, which included communists. But in England, and here's my point, in 1936, what was most people worrying about in England? The morals of their king and whether he could marry a divorced woman and did adultery matter? So, you know, history is full of these what ifs, but what if we hadn't been so distracted by the abdication and Wallis Simpson? Might the British have stopped Hitler in the Rhineland? So 1936 is a very key year. And of course, I understand why Ethel would have joined the Communist Party in 1936.
And I think the next thing that I was wondering as well was, you know, I know that from your book, the genesis of this was when you lived in New York in the 1970s and read the book of Daniel. And one of the, as someone that also lived in New York formerly, one of the things is if you stop and you listen, sometimes you can hear the past whisper to you in New York City. Is that something that you experienced? Is that why you wanted to write? Did you decide back then you wanted to write on her? Or is that planted?
No, it was a seed that was planted. You know, we're talking about 1978. I lived in Brooklyn Heights. I was the mother of a son and a daughter. So the book of Daniel particularly spoke to me. I didn't know then that the reality was about two boys, but I also read The Star and Sophie's Choice at that point. So, you know, these were the issues I was thinking about. My grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, so we often walked over the Brooklyn Bridge on a Sunday into the Lower East Side. And you know, I started to think of what if, but I couldn't possibly have written that book then. I had to do a lot of growing up and become a real mother, not just a mother of babies. I think the precise moment when I locked into this story was after I wrote a book about women in wartime Paris, which was referred to in the introduction. And my publishers were nice enough to say, well, Anne, there were lots of women spies in that book. Can't you pick out a woman spy in Paris and write about her? And so I was looking at women spies, and then I remembered this story. I mean, I really remember with a clarity how it just suddenly dropped into my mind. And I remembered that I'd always known about Ethel, who, as anyone will know who's read my book, I don't believe was a spy, but she was clearly married to one and close to those circles. So it seemed to me that it's coming up for 70 years. This was the right moment. It was the right sort of distance to look at this story with some clarity. There were still people alive, I hoped, and I was lucky enough to meet in California the social worker who had looked after Michael. Of course, Michael and Robbie were a great help, but I didn't want to make this an authorized book. So we all kept our distance from each other while I was writing it. I thought that was important, but it was also important that there were people alive who were familiar with this story and who had lived through it. And so that was the precise moment that I decided I really wanted to tell this story that I realized I had had at the back of my mind for a number of years.
And I think it's quite interesting that it's landed on an English woman and a Scottish man to try to break down a story that divided America. But let's give it a go.
Only you two are up to it. Only you two can do it.
And I guess the question was there a sense that I'm walking into a little bit of a minefield here? Historians argue about this stuff. People get very emotive about it. There's still a political divide that it doesn't determine, but it definitely, there's a correlation between your politics and where you land on this issue. So I just wondered if you could help us understand the process of walking into this and kind of dealing with it all and dealing with the reviews and all of the other things, good or bad or indifferent. Tell us about walking forward into dealing with this important case.
With great trepidation and fear, and I like to think humiliation and a number of minefields. But you know, if you decide not to do it, you could say that it gives me some distance. When I wrote about Mother Teresa, I was very worried about that I wasn't a Catholic. But you know, you can learn and you can talk to people. I think there is a universal message here, though. I always say if my book is about one thing, or actually I'm going to say two things, but if my book is about one thing, it's about the importance of the rule of law. And that applies to every single country. And what happens when a government decides willingly to overturn the rights of one of its citizens, that a citizen is expendable for the greater good. I mean, that is not necessarily American, that's true for everyone. And the other thing that my book is about a family and how, or two families, you could say, a dysfunctional family at the beginning, the Greenglasses, in which Ethel grew up, and a redemptive family at the end, the Mirapols, who rescued these two sons. And, you know, family tragedies and sibling rivalry is something that is also universal. So there are many universal messages. This happened to play out in America for reasons which I'm sure you and I know well, and perhaps we don't need to rehearse it here. But I think it is interesting to make a comparison between the American attitude to espionage and the Russians and the Cold War and the British attitude. So, I mean, very briefly, I might say something here, because Ethel's story unraveled in 1950, if you like. I mean, you could go back to Yalta, you could go back to Winston Churchill's speech in 46 and the Iron Curtain, but really it's in 1949 when Russia drops the atom bomb and America cannot believe that Russia can possibly have access to atomic power. And that's when the secret information, which we now know is Venona, led to the arrest of Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs confesses, but my point is that he was, although formerly a German who'd worked at the Los Alamos project, he was arrested in England, in Cambridge. And the way the Brits deal with it is what is so interesting. They hush it up. They don't really want to make a big deal about it. They're rather embarrassed. And that's how the British have dealt with spies after that, you know, Philby and the Cambridge Five. And it's Klaus Fuchs's arrest that he names names. He names Harry Gold. Harry Gold names David Greenglass, and David Greenglass names Julius, not Julius and Ethel, Julius. And the buck stops there. Julius doesn't name any names. But the Americans react in a completely different way. They blow this up and want to make this as big a deal as possible. They want the world, but more importantly, I think they want their own political constituents to see we are strong in the face of the communist threat. We're strong in the face of spies. So we're going to have a big trial, and we're going to show that people who are traitors are punished with the death penalty. So, you know, this is big news, but it's completely different to how the British deal with it. So I just think that's an interesting comparison.
Okay, so I think now it would be good to just focus in on the spy espionage angle, especially since we are the International Spy Museum. So you know, you say that you don't believe that Ethel was a spy. Can you just unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I think she was married to a spy. It's not something that most civilized countries kill you for, to be married to any kind of criminal. You're not criminalized for what you think or what you believe. You're guilty for overt acts. So Ethel was convicted. I'm not quite sure how much background you want me to give. So Julius was arrested for conspiracy to commit espionage, not treason, and that's important for a reason I'll come to. Conspiracy is almost impossible to disprove. And when Julius did not name names, and it turned out, and he didn't know this, that the FBI had this secret information, the Venona cables, which did name Julius. They had been able to identify him, but these Venona cables did not name Ethel. So there are 3,000 of these cables that were actually decrypted, of which 19 mention Julius and Ethel at all. And of those 19, only 2 mention Ethel and 1 by her name. The other one she's referred to as a wife. So she's referred to as Ethel. She never had a code name. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think she was a spy. I don't think she was a spy because the KGB didn't think she was a spy. They didn't treat her as a spy. They said Ethel knows about Julius's work. So, you know, I think that's fairly clear, but she does not work. Now, that could be interpreted in various ways, that she doesn't go out to have a job, but the 2 men who are responsible for decrypting, Meredith Gardner and Robert Lamfair, added an additional memorandum to make it clear that while it could mean that, it probably means that she wasn't part of the KGB. So, I mean, the KGB network, nobody thinks Ethel had a direct line to the KGB. So why was she found guilty? There had to be an overt act. And this is one of the multiple miscarriages of justice in the trial. The only overt act was the perjury of her brother David, who did a plea bargain in order to get a lesser sentence himself, and that his wife Ruth, who was a spy, was not indicted at all. He said he had seen his sister Ethel do the typing. When he came out of prison just shy of 10 years later, he said that actually he didn't remember who'd done the typing. Maybe nobody had done the typing. And if anyone had, it was his wife. His views on this are rather garbled, but in his grand jury testimony, where he made statements before he was charged at all, he said, leave my sister out of it, not just because she's my sister, but she had nothing to do with it. So unfortunately, in 1951, it was not possible for the defense to see a grand jury statement, so they didn't know how what David had said and how David and his wife had cooked up this plot to make Ethel appear as if she committed an overt act. Now, I said multiple miscarriages of justice. I mean, that's one, but the other was that, and of course Ethel didn't know what she was facing before she was on the witness stand, but the other was that the judge and the prosecution frequently referred to this trial as treason, whereas actually, as I've said, they were being charged for conspiracy to commit espionage. Treason was completely different and required different evidence. It required two people to be witnesses. But by referring to treason all the time, the jury believed that they were trying Julius and Ethel for treason. So, you know, that's what they were eventually found guilty of.
And I think just to come back to that just a little bit, you know, just setting to one side the miscarriages of justice, the penalty, the way that they tried to squeeze Julius by, you know, as Michael has said elsewhere, holding Ethel hostage, just putting all that to one side for the moment, not saying that it's not important, but just, you know, to try to break this problem down. On the charge of conspiracy to commit espionage, you know, some historians say that case is closed. That just was the case. In 1995, with the Venona decrypts, Julius was definitively, you know, that was something that was decided then. And then not long after that, the Vasiliev notebooks, which you reference in your bibliography, just really briefly going to read from that. So this is talking about Julius. He gave valuable materials on radio and oversaw probationers who had been handed over from Sound. And then they list 8 different agents that Julius was, you know, recruited. And then it goes on to say his wife knows about her husband's work and personally knows Twain and Callistratus, that's 2 of the Soviet handlers. She could be used independently, but she should not be overworked because she's got poor health. Does that not suggest that she, you know, she was an enthusiastic supporter? Maybe she wasn't the agent that was gathering material, but it's not like she just said, I'm going to the other room and don't tell me what you're up to. I mean, she was there at meetings. She knew Soviet handlers. She had met people. And yeah, I just wondered if you could comment on the Vasiliev notebooks.
Yes.
And,
well, the Vasiliev notebooks, the provenance is very convoluted. So they're very hard to prove while the KGB archives are closed. You know, they were not photocopies. We don't have the actual documents. We have somebody who's transcribed and translated and decrypted. I'm not saying they're not necessarily true. I'm just saying they're not definitive in any way. And what I was trying to do was not really relitigate the trial. I'm trying to build a picture of a woman, a supportive woman. I really don't make any bones about that. Of course she was supportive and approved and knew, and they lived in a small flat, and it's very hard to imagine she wasn't aware of it. But that is not even if you can prove that she was complicit, because, as I say, it's impossible to disprove. Of course, in a close marriage, they had conversations. And it's a love story. She loved Julius, but it's not a crime that you kill somebody for. And when she was arrested, the FBI knew that the evidence against Ethel was shaky at best. It was weak. She was arrested in order to use her as a lever, as a pawn. So, you know, her arrest was on dubious grounds. Once she was arrested, they cooked up this story. And the Vasiliev notebooks have come back to us later. They were not available at the trial, and had they been, they actually would have been inadmissible evidence. So I'm perfectly aware of them. They don't tell me or you any more about Ethel than you already know. She approved of what her husband was doing. I'm not sure that she actively took part in the conspiracy, and I don't think you can prove that. And even if you can, it's not a crime that you kill somebody for.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to stay on this just for one more minute. Yeah, the evidence is one thing, like the evidence that convicted them, and that's shot through with all kinds of problems that we could discuss at length. The punishment is also problematic to me personally and as a historian for many different reasons, but we're just talking about the charge of conspiracy to commit espionage. I guess that's where I was just trying to focus in on. And at the moment, the preponderance of evidence, like you say, we don't have like half a dozen sources, but we do have cables that were, sent from New York to Moscow. We do have notebooks from the KGB that I mean, the dial is surely shifting towards Ethel being, implicated in this conspiracy. I guess I just, I don't, the evidence and the punishment are important, and they're separate questions, but I'm just focusing on this because we're the international
Spy Museum. Yeah.
And a lot of our listeners, these are the questions that they're going to be asking. So one thing I learned as an interviewer is don't ask the questions you want to ask the questions the people that are watching want to ask. So I wondered if you could just indulge me and pick that up a little bit more.
Yeah, fine. I would just go back to the fact that as far as the KGB were concerned, they did not see her as part of their spy network. She was married to a spy. I really don't think you can prove anymore. I'm not sure that the dial is shifting in the way that you describe. I think it's very clear from what we know that she was a loving and supportive wife who approved and knew, but that's not a crime worthy of a death penalty. I mean, Klaus Fuchs was given 14 years and he was a spy, and David was given 10. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't fit the evidence. And I don't think, however much you tell me that there is new evidence, and it is only the Vasiliev notebooks, which, as I say, are not proof, and it's hard to say that they're actually definitive because we don't actually have the copies. It's one man, and based on Julius's conversations, they're not actually KGB documents. So I fully understand that one's preconceived notions, if you believe that anyone who supported a communist spy is automatically guilty because, America could not possibly withstand communist spies, and there were communist spies who were supplying information. And that was dangerous. And I'm not defending spying against your country. I'm really, truly not. I'm trying to focus on one woman who was a supportive wife. And while I really say in many places that she supported what he was doing, I still think it's hard to make that leap and say, therefore, she was a spy. And as one newspaper commented, a ruthless spy. I think one has to be precise, and it's important.
And just before Michael joins us, I just wondered as well, and indulge me on this, Anne, the title of the book, Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, and some of the reviewers say that it's Shakespearean, and in the book you say that it's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy, but I wondered if you thought that it could be closer to a Greek tragedy, because in Shakespearean tragedy, it's because of flaws of the character. But it seems to me that the way that you've written the book, it's fate that's trapped Ethel in her predicament. And it reminds me, if you've ever read it, Antigone by Sophocles, where Antigone's caught between the king Creon, who represents the state and the law, and between her brother Polynices, who's dead, who she wants to bury, and that's a family connection. And this is Antigone, and she's caught between the pull of family and the pull of the state, and she's caught in between, and fate churns her up. Is that not
Yes,
what you're...
I'll certainly give you that as well. I mean, I was really looking at the drama of the brother and the sister. it's a tragedy of whatever nature. It happened in America. I mean, the title, of course, has a double meaning. So it's a tragedy that happened to an American citizen. It was also a tragedy for America because, as I quote the Deputy Attorney General said at the end, she called our bluff. So, I mean, they knew that they did not have definitive evidence against her. But at that point, there was no going back. They'd used her as a lever, as a pawn, and she was not going to give them the satisfaction of naming other names. So, you know, it seems to me it's a tragedy on many different levels, but to orphan two boys, to kill a woman that they know they don't have conclusive evidence against because they've got themselves into this situation, is a tragedy by any description, you know, Greek, American, Shakespearean, or whatever. And, you know, I think I come back to the sibling rivalry and the way that you see the judge resort to so much misogyny is a tragedy as well. You know, that Ethel was 3 years older, the emphasis on the typing, because, you know, for a woman to subvert the roles expected of a woman, the whole typewriter business is very important to the trial, to show that this woman is a danger to American society. And the Jello box, you know, they're playing with the roles of, here's an American housewife who has dared to step out of her box as a housewife, and now put her back in, and, you know, don't let women in your life dare to step out of this box. So it's, yeah, a tragedy at many levels.
Okay, and yeah, a character in that tragedy is Michael, and I think it's probably time to for Michael to take part, and then for us to transfer over to Amanda. But thanks, Anne.
Thank you.
All right, we have lots of questions and they run from overarching to real, you know, minutia. So let's just go with them immediately, reacting to what you read from the journalism of the time, Anne, which I was shuddering with horror, imagining someone describing me in that tone. It just was so horribly damning. One of our guests wanted to know that, did the prejudicial reporting at that time lead maybe later to any redos? Was there any thought about that? I mean, did journalists feel that they had been prejudicial, or did everyone just feel comfortable? Michael.
Well, I see Michael shaking his head. Perhaps he has a better answer. But as you said, 70% of people believed that it was right to electrocute these people. So I'm not sure there was any journalistic pushback. But Michael, do you have anything on that?
First of all, Andrew and Anne, it was wonderful listening to that conversation. Journalists, I think, never had second thoughts. They were doing the work of informing the public about these dangerous people, and they stuck to that story. And in fact, I would make the case that even to this very day, the New York Times has had the thumb on the scale against our family right up to the present. The New York Times is supposed to be the liberal paper.
Can I add one more thing? So after the electrocution, Bob Considine was the reporter chosen because there had to be reporters watching, and he was the one chosen to report on this to the world. And you can find his YouTube clip. And apart from the fact that he was visibly shocked by it all, he can't get the word stethoscope out, he chokes on it. He then utters these extraordinary words that the 3 volts jolts of electricity that they gave Ethel were not enough. They would have been enough to kill an ordinary person, is what he says. So it wasn't just women reporters, it was reporters who really were feeding the public and probably genuinely believed that Ethel was some kind of abnormal. I mean, that's what he says. It was not enough to kill an ordinary person. And of course, the obvious reason that was that she was too small for the straps. I think I've frozen, but you probably heard what I was saying.
we could hear you, and you did do really meaningful coverage of the execution that you kind of bookend the book with, and it was very hard to read. But since we are on that topic, I will skip ahead to a question wondering if Eisenhower, did he know what the Venona decrypts had to say before he went forward with the execution order, or did not commute it?
I think the answer is he did at the end. He may not have known all the way along, but I think he was convinced.
But let's remember, he didn't know the details that led Gardner and Lamphere to get who to recommend against the death sentence for my mother. He was told in general that there was secret evidence that proved, and Brownell lied to him, his attorney general, because Brownell said they both were guilty. In fact, we now know from Venona that it only tells half the story. It says Julius is guilty and Ethel does not work.
Yeah.
So we have several people who are wondering about anti-Semitism in this case, which hasn't really been mentioned in the talk, but they want to know if you mentioned in the book, or if you have any comments you want to share here about that role, the role of anti-Semitism in the case.
Of course, it's part of the whole toxic stew of misogyny, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, fear. It's absolutely present. And of course, I talk about it. And it's really hard to break down at precisely what point it played a role. I don't argue that it played a role in the arrest, because if you look at the arrest of Klaus Fuchs, that led in a direct line to the arrest of Julius. I don't think that you can prove that it led to an increase in anti-Semitism. However, you can't just say it wasn't there. So I think if you look at the trial where the judge, the prosecutor, the defendants, the defense, everybody is Jewish except the jury. So of course there's anti-Semitism at play there. Why wasn't there a Jewish jury member? Well, many of the prospective jurors who were Jewish had excused themselves. But actually, I think it is darker than that. I think the fact that Kaufman and Cohn and Sapol, who were all anti-Ethel and Julius, really wanted to get these jobs. You can almost compare it to the role of Jewish capos in concentration camps, where Jews are put in control deliberately to make it look as if, well, you can't say this is anti-Semitic. Look, we've got Jews running the show. So of course it's not anti-Semitic. So that was a sort of clever ploy in a way, although, you know, you can argue that it happened organically. I think, as Arthur Miller said, you know, 5 years after the end of the Holocaust, when so many millions of Jews had been killed, to have two more Jews with obvious Jewish names being burnt, it is impossible to say that there was no anti-Semitism at play. There was real fear that Jews were Bolsheviks, Jews were communists, Jews were not to be trusted as patriotic Americans. But it's nonetheless really hard to pin down at what point it played a role. Michael, I'm sure you've got a different take.
I think that Kaufman and Sapol were very conscious of the fact that they had to demonstrate to the Goyim that they were good Jews, and they were going to make sure that the Jew commie Rosenbergs got killed. They were the bad Jews.
Can I just briefly jump in? That these were questions that I never got a chance to get to, but I think it's really fascinating the role that this played in the American Jewish experience, or the Jewish experience more generally, for some of the reasons Anne described, and even thinking about if anyone ever gets a chance to go to New York City, one of the best tours I've ever taken is a walking tour of the Jewish Lower East Side. And that really takes you back to the period when that was the epicenter of the American Jewish experience. And I think 1 in 4, Jewish people in America have some link that goes back to the Lower East Side. So I would recommend reading Anne's book and maybe taking that walking tour, and you can get a sense of the world that Ethel and Julius inhabited.
And I was just going to say, the Jewish community was really divided in its response. And I suppose it was fear of a different kind that prevented the Lower East Side Jews and certain Jewish newspapers from jumping to the defense immediately. So it took a while before the clemency campaign got underway. And Jewish newspapers were very slow in coming to even cover the story. So, then as now, the Jewish community did not speak with one voice.
We have lots of people who are wrestling with why didn't they plead guilty to, why didn't they do something to save their life? And Anne, you really look at that from many angles in your book. You can say, buy the book and find out what I think, or you can give us just a little taste, both of you, Anne, in what you've written, Michael, in what you've lived, and think about your parents' choice.
Well, I think they didn't plead guilty because Julius believed that there was not evidence against him. He didn't know about the Venona cables. And he thought that if they continued to protest their innocence, they would both be eventually not found guilty. They didn't know about David's perjury. And so, and they believed in the American Constitution, and that's why they pleaded the Fifth Amendment, which of course didn't work for Ethel because she was believed not to be trustworthy, but it was a tool at her disposal. But I think they thought that was their best chance to get off.
I'm going to answer that very briefly. It's extraordinarily complicated because for my father to plead guilty, he would have had to say, well, I'm half guilty of what I'm been charged with, but my wife's not guilty at all. And they would have said, well, see, he just confessed. And then he would have been confessed guilty of everything. But confession wasn't enough. He had to name names, and he had gotten a whole bunch of his friends involved in this. And he wasn't going to put them in the situation he was in. And I don't for the minute believe that it was like, this unbelievably ideological rigidity, I'm going to die for the great Soviet motherland. It's more simple. I have all these friends and I'm not going to rat them out, period, the end.
And Anne, you do strongly suggest that Julius was the optimist and that Ethel was much more clear-eyed about what was possibly the outcome of their situation. And also a very great love story, I think, is an interesting part of this. So an intriguing question, because lots of them are the questions you'd expect, and Andrew and I could have predicted, and they're really spy and they're really cool. But this is from a relative, Michael. Their grandmother was a cousin of Ethel, and the grandmother has very lovely stories about Ethel, intelligence, interesting, kind, and fun. And these relatives that you may or may not know, Michael, want to know if Anne considers, and I guess you too, Michael, considers David Greenglass a sociopath.
I'm not going to put those labels on. I don't feel qualified. He was weak. He was torn by his wife's pressure. I don't think he thought it through. I don't think he was clever. I think he was just weak.
I think that's a fair comment. Remember, the very first interview he had with the FBI, he put his wife right in the middle of it. It took him another day before he implicated my father. And then later on, he said, oh, wait, Ethel had nothing to do with this. He doesn't know what's going on. He's trapped. And then he's a puppet in the hands of the prosecutors.
One of the very first questions that came in, I think before the guest realized you were joining us, Michael, was wondering what it was like to be hidden during the period when it was dangerous to be you as a child, and did other children of communists end up in sort of witness protection plans, if you have any knowledge on that?
The last one, the answer is no, and certainly there's a lot to tell about that. And I hate to say this, but I wrote about it in my book, We Are Your Sons, and it's available for free online, I'm almost sure. The whole first half of it is about my childhood. So I don't want to take any more time here, but there's a lot to tell.
Probably one final, maybe even more of a comment about the KGB. Is there any chance that they didn't acknowledge Ethel's strength in her role in support because they were male chauvinists?
Listen, I'm not a KGB expert. I really don't think I've got anything useful to say to that, but I think you have to take some things on face value. They did talk about Ethel as Julius's wife. They did say she didn't work. You know, could you explain that because they were male chauvinists? I'm sure there's an element in the 1950s of everyone having that attitude, but you know, there were women spies, lots of women spies, and there had been since Martyr Hari. So
and in the Venona decryptions that talk about Ethel not working, they give Ruth Greenglass a code name, and they talk at length about all the things that she's going to do.
Well, I have to say, everyone watching today has lots of opinions, and lots of people are just chiming in with really good information, but everyone has an assignment. They need to read Anne's book. They need to read Michael's book. They need to visit the Spy Museum. They need to listen to all of Andrew's podcasts and the rest of our programs. But was that enough of a pitch for the Spy Museum? But we're overwhelmed by these amazing questions. We will share your questions and comments with Anne and Michael. I want you to know that we can do that, even though our time has run out. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our incredible guests.
Michael and Robert's book. I don't want to leave my brother out. We co-wrote We Are Your Sons.
Yes, good. You are such a kind man, Michael. I want to thank my wonderful colleague, Andrew, for moderating and asking good and tough questions. And I want to thank everyone for being here. And if you've enjoyed this and you get a lot out of our free programs, don't hesitate to contribute to the Spy Museum. We can always use your support. And our next program is very different in tone. We are teaming up with our friends in the youth education department, and we are having a back to school happy hour, which is very needed for parents. Two former CIA, an analyst, an operator who are married and have kids are going to tell you how they're going to give you a license to parent as we look at the new school year. So that is next Wednesday, September 1st at 5:30. So we're always here for you with the content. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I love talking about it and always learn something new. So it's great to be in Washington for a day, for an hour.
We'd like to be with you where you are at an undisclosed location. Take care, everyone.
Bye.